A woman walks into a consulting room. She is exhausted in a way sleep does not fix. Her hands tremble. She has headaches and a heaviness in her chest, and sometimes her legs simply stop working for reasons no one can explain. She has come to be believed. The physician listens and then writes a single word in his notes, and that word will follow her for the rest of her life. It will determine whether she is treated or dismissed, whether she keeps her freedom or loses it, whether anyone ever looks for what is actually wrong with her. The word is hysteria. And for roughly 2,500 years, it was the most common diagnosis given to women in the Western world. A diagnosis that could mean almost anything, that had no consistent symptoms, no test, and no cure, and that quietly served one enormous purpose. It gave a name to the moment a doctor decided a woman's suffering was not real. A quick warning before we go further: this one is grim, and every word of it is true. The word itself gives away where it began. It comes from the Greek for womb, and the original theory, written down in the medical texts of ancient Greece, was almost unbelievably literal, that the womb was not fixed in place, but was capable of wandering around inside the body. The idea went like this: a womb that had gone too long without pregnancy would become light and dry and restless. It would detach and drift upward through the body in search of moisture, pressing on the lungs, the heart, the throat, and wherever it lodged, it produced symptoms: choking, if it reached the throat; breathlessness, if it pressed the chest; fainting, dizziness, weeping, and a sense of suffocation that patients described over and over for centuries. The physicians of the ancient world took this seriously enough to develop treatments based on it. If the womb wandered because it was seeking moisture and warmth, then the solution was to lure it back down. Sweet-smelling substances were applied below, to draw the organ downward, while foul-smelling ones, burnt hair, pitch, were held under the nose to drive it away from the upper body. The patient was, in effect, being used as a set of bellows to herd an organ back into position, and the standard long-term prescription was as simple as it was consequential. Marriage, pregnancy, a womb that was doing its expected work would not wander. From the very beginning, the treatment for a woman's unexplained suffering was to place her more firmly inside the role society had already chosen for her. Now, it would be easy to laugh at the wandering womb, but look closely at the structure of the idea, because that structure is the thing that survives. A cluster of real symptoms: exhaustion, breathlessness, weakness, pain, is gathered under one label. The cause is located in the fact of being a woman, and the cure is compliance. Every single version of hysteria that follows over the next 2,000 years keeps that structure and simply changes the costume. In medieval and early modern Europe, the costume became religious. If a woman convulsed, or spoke in ways that made no sense, or collapsed, or refused to eat, the explanation was no longer a drifting organ. It was a spiritual one. She might be possessed. She might be a witch. And the consequences of that reading were not medical at all. They were lethal. Historians still debate how many of the women accused during the Great Witch Panics were suffering from conditions we would now recognize as epilepsy, psychosis, neurological disease, or simple malnutrition. Nobody disputes the basic mechanism. An unexplained female body produced an explanation that placed the fault inside the woman and then punished her for it. By the 18th and 19th centuries, medicine had reclaimed the territory from the church. Hysteria was, once again, a disease. But it had become something much stranger, an enormously fashionable diagnosis with an almost limitless list of symptoms. And when we say limitless, we mean it. Physicians of the era compiled lists of hysterical symptoms that ran to dozens of entries, and in some cases well over 100. Nervousness, insomnia, irritability, fluid retention, shortness of breath, loss of appetite, excessive appetite, muscle spasms, fainting, laughing too much, crying too much, a tendency to cause trouble. A woman could be diagnosed as hysterical for being anxious, for being bored, for being sexually interested, for being sexually uninterested, for being unhappy in her marriage, or for reading too many novels. Consider what that actually means. A diagnosis that includes everything diagnoses nothing. It is not a description of a disease. It is a container, one that could hold any woman whose behavior, mood, or body did not fit what was expected of her, and give that mismatch the authority of medicine. If the buried corners of our own history keep pulling you in like this, take a second to subscribe, Digging up the grimmest true stories our species has left behind is the entire reason this channel exists. And stay with this one, because what happened next turned suffering women into a form of public entertainment. In late 19th century, Paris stood the Salpetriere, an enormous hospital that housed thousands of women. And there, one of the most celebrated neurologists in the world made hysteria the center of his life's work. His name was Jean-Martin Charcot, and his contribution is genuinely double-edged in a way that is worth being honest about. On one side, he did something important. He insisted that hysteria was a real neurological condition, not moral weakness or play acting, and he took the suffering of these women seriously as a medical problem when much of the profession simply sneered. He studied them meticulously. He photographed them. He built the most detailed record of the condition that had ever existed. But on the other side, he held public lectures. Every week, an audience of physicians, students, writers, and fashionable Parisians would fill a hall, and Charcot would bring out his patients and induce their symptoms in front of the crowd, using hypnosis and pressure applied to what he believed were trigger points on the body. The women would arch, convulse, freeze in dramatic postures, and the audience would watch. These sessions became famous. They were the intellectual entertainment of the age. And there is a deeply uncomfortable question sitting underneath all of it, which historians still argue about today. Charcot's star patients performed their symptoms so consistently and so theatrically that it is genuinely unclear how much of what the audience saw was the illness and how much was a performance the women had learned, consciously or not, because attention, food, shelter, and status inside the hospital depended on producing it. These were poor women, many of whom had nowhere else to go. The most celebrated hysterics in Europe were, in a very real sense, performing the disease their doctors wanted to see. Sitting in that audience in Paris was a young Austrian physician who would take the whole subject somewhere nobody expected. His name was Sigmund Freud, and hysteria is, quite literally, where psychoanalysis was born. Back in Vienna, Freud and an older colleague, Joseph Breuer, became preoccupied with a single case. The patient is known to history by a pseudonym, Anna O. She was a young, highly intelligent woman who, while nursing her dying father, developed a bewildering set of symptoms: paralysis in her limbs, disturbances of vision, a persistent cough, and periods when she lost the ability to speak her native German and could communicate only in English. What Breuer did with her was, for its time, radical. He did not confine her, or operate on her, or prescribe her a husband. He listened, session after session. He let her talk her way back to the first moment each individual symptom had appeared, and he recorded that as she did so, the symptoms would sometimes ease or disappear entirely. She gave the process the name that stuck. She called it the talking cure. That case, published alongside others in a book on hysteria in 1895, is the foundation stone of modern psychotherapy. The idea that buried experience could produce physical symptoms, and that speaking about it could relieve them, grows directly out of the study of hysterical women. Every therapy session happening anywhere in the world today descends from these case notes. But there are two things about that story that are rarely mentioned, and both matter. The first is that the triumphant ending was not quite true. The published account implied a clean recovery. In reality, the young woman was institutionalized afterwards, and her illness continued for years. She did eventually recover, and went on to become a formidable social worker and campaigner, a far more interesting life than the case study allowed her. Her name was Bertha Pappenheim. The second is what Freud went on to build on that foundation. He came to argue that hysteria was rooted in repressed sexual experience, and this had a dark consequence that echoed the whole history of the diagnosis. When women described real abuse, there was now a respectable theoretical framework available for interpreting those accounts as fantasy rather than memory. A discipline born from listening to women very quickly developed a sophisticated method for not believing them. Which brings us to the fact that quietly demolishes the entire 2,000-year theory, because hysteria was never actually confined to women. Charcot himself had insisted on this. Working with men who had survived railway accidents and industrial injuries, he documented male patients with the identical symptom picture: tremors, paralysis, loss of speech, seizures with no detectable physical cause, and argued that hysteria was a neurological condition that could occur in anyone. It was not a popular position. Many of his colleagues found the idea of a hysterical man close to absurd, since the entire diagnosis was built on the womb. And then came the First World War. Soldiers began returning from the trenches, unable to stop shaking. Men who could not speak, could not walk, went blind or deaf with nothing physically wrong with their eyes or their ears, or who collapsed into convulsions. At first, the assumption was physical, that the blast waves from exploding shells had bruised the brain. They called it shell shock, but cases kept appearing in men who had never been near an explosion, and the physical theory came apart. What these men presented with was symptom for symptom, what physicians had been calling hysteria in women for centuries. Some doctors at the time said so openly, and in that moment the ancient theory should have collapsed entirely, because here were tens of thousands of young men, with no wombs to wander, displaying the classic disease. Instead, the profession split the diagnosis in two. What was hysteria in a woman became, in a soldier, either a nervous injury deserving of sympathy or cowardice. Some were treated with rest and talking therapy. Others were given painful electrical treatments, designed to make the symptom less bearable than returning to the front. And a number of men whose bodies had simply stopped obeying them were court-martialed as deserters and shot. The same set of symptoms, two completely different explanations, decided by which body they appeared in. Meanwhile, in Britain and America, a different treatment had taken hold for women, one that sounds gentle and was, for many who endured it, close to torture. It was called the rest cure. The prescription was total. The patient was confined to bed for weeks, sometimes months. She was isolated from her family. She was fed a heavy diet, often built around milk, and deliberately fattened. She was forbidden to leave the bed, in some cases forbidden even to sit up unaided or to feed herself. And crucially, she was forbidden to work, to write, to read, or to engage in any intellectual activity whatsoever. The theory held that a woman's nervous energy was a finite resource and that thinking too much had drained it. The most famous account of it comes from a writer who was subjected to the rest cure and was ordered afterwards to live as domestic a life as possible and never to touch a pen again as long as she lived. She later wrote that the treatment drove her to the edge of a complete breakdown, and she turned that experience into a short story that has been read ever since as one of the great accounts of a mind being destroyed by its own treatment. Her name was Charlotte Perkins Gilman, and the story was The Yellow Wallpaper. Read the rest cure honestly, and the shape of it is unmistakable. A woman is exhausted, unhappy, unwell. The treatment is to remove her occupation, her correspondence, her books, her independence, and her control over her own body, and to keep her in bed until she agrees to be well. It is the ancient prescription in a new form. The cure is still compliance, and for the women whose symptoms did not resolve, the road went further down. Hysteria was among the reasons women were committed to asylums, where the diagnosis could keep them for years. Once inside, a woman's protest against her confinement could itself be recorded as further evidence of her hysteria, a trap with no exit, since calm proved the treatment was working and distress proved she still needed to be there. Some were subjected to surgery. Because the womb had been blamed from the very beginning, it was removed. Hysterectomies and the removal of ovaries were performed as treatments for hysteria and related nervous conditions, major surgery, in an era of primitive anesthesia and worse infection control carried out on women whose actual complaint was often exhaustion, grief, or a marriage they could not escape. In the same period, other physicians attempted still more disturbing operations aimed at the genitals. These were never the mainstream treatment, and they were controversial among doctors at the time, but they happened, and they happened because the underlying logic permitted it. If the fault is located in a woman's body, then the body is what you cut.
Now we need to address something directly, because it is by far the most repeated claim about this whole subject, and it is not solid. You have almost certainly heard that Victorian doctors treated hysteria by manually bringing women to orgasm, and that the electric vibrator was invented to spare physicians the effort. It is everywhere.
It has been a film, a stage play, and about 10,000 internet posts. It comes from a single book published in the late 1990s, and in 2018, two historians published a detailed examination of the sources that book relied on, and found that they simply do not say what the book claimed. There is no good evidence that this was a standard medical treatment, and none that the vibrator was invented for it. Some of the cited sources describe entirely different procedures. Others do not describe the practice at all, which is worth pausing on. The true history of hysteria involves confinement, forced isolation, the removal of healthy organs, and 2,000 years of women being told their pain was imaginary, and the version that went viral was the titillating one. which means that even now, the story of these women is being retold in whatever shape the audience finds most entertaining. That is not a small irony. It is the same mechanism that put them on a stage in Paris. So how did it end? Slowly, and then all at once. Through the 20th century, the vast territory that hysteria had occupied was steadily carved up by real diagnoses. Epilepsy was understood properly. Multiple sclerosis, syphilis of the nervous system, thyroid disorders, autoimmune disease, migraine, anxiety disorders, depression, post-traumatic stress, each one took a piece of what had been called hysteria and gave it a name, a mechanism, and in many cases a treatment. The diagnosis did not fall to a single discovery. It was dismantled, piece by piece, by everything that turned out to be real. And in 1980, the American Psychiatric Association removed hysteria from its diagnostic manual altogether. After 25 centuries, the most enduring diagnosis in the history of Western medicine simply ceased to exist. But the thing underneath it did not go anywhere, and this is the part that matters most. Modern medicine has extensive research on how symptoms are assessed differently, depending on who is describing them. Studies have repeatedly found that women reporting pain are more likely than men to have it attributed to emotional or psychological causes, are less likely to receive strong pain relief, and often wait longer for a diagnosis in conditions that are difficult to see on a scan. Autoimmune diseases and chronic pain conditions, which affect women disproportionately, are frequently diagnosed only after years of being told that nothing is wrong. Nobody writes the word hysteria in a chart anymore. But the underlying reflex, the moment a doctor cannot find a cause and concludes the problem must be the patient's mind rather than the limits of the test, is not an antique. It is a living thing, and it has simply learned to use more modern language, which leaves the question worth sitting with. For 2,500 years, the medical profession had a word that meant we cannot find what is wrong with you, so we have decided nothing is. It was not a lie, exactly. Almost every physician who used it believed it completely.